Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the Cabinet of Barbados, members of the Parliament of Barbados, members of the Democratic Labour Party, parishioners of Christ Church, distinguished members of the family of Christ Church, visiting friends, ladies and gentlemen. I am relieved that I don't have to back for too long because the runs have already been knocked off. I'm just here for a cameo display before we all go to the pavilion. And I'm very pleased to be here tonight in the school hall of the Christ Church Foundation School. This compound accompanied for 9 years of my life. Franz LeBron and I came here together. What? The 13th day of September 1960. And I sat next to Frank Alley tonight. What Frank Alley does not know is that while we were in first form, there was a teacher here with the name of Irvin King who would have taught him at school as well. And in holding up before us boys who had left school and after whose example we should follow, he called the name of Frank Alley. And he said it was his conviction that Frank Alley would either be a leader of Barbados or would certainly be a person of some conspicuous greatness in Barbados. Irving King is dead. No, Frank Alley is here. But attained to the highest eminence of his profession as an economist, professor at the University of the West Indies. And therefore lived out the promise which his teachers saw in him so many years ago. I look at the wall and I see Lee Harper Skeetoff, to whom my Lord Chambers were named. Lee Harper Skeet made a very deep impression on my life, and a very deep impression on the lives of most of us who came to this compound before I came and while I was here. When I came here, of course, Bobby Morris was here. Lawrence Nurse, who went on to work with the Barbados Workers Union and then went on to teach at the university, he was here. Gabby Scott was here. David Jennings was here. And on I could go. And it was from all of these that I benefited from it was from their example and from their inspiration that I was able to benefit, and really would not want to divorce anything that I have achieved from their continuing inspiration. So let me say thanks to all of them for being as good to me as they've always been. I spoke in St. James North last night at the opening of the constituency office of Senator Harry Husbands. And I said then that politics is not intended to be a spectator sport. Politics is serious business. Politicians have the capacity to cause defenseless citizens an enormous amount of pain if they are the wrong people. And they have the capacity to give those same citizens a sense of fulfillment if they are the right people. And you heard from the MPs for Christ Church here tonight. You heard from Stephen Lashley, John Boyce, and Ronald Jones. These are not only very good members of Parliament, but very good ministers of the Crown. And Barbados is very, very lucky to be able to boast of people like these at this time. They have been reviled and persecuted by their adversaries in the Barbados Labour Party. But they have stuck to the task. I suppose they remember the words of our Lord, "Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and say all manner of evil against you falsely, for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you." So you don't get too worried when you're under attack by political scams. Because as I have said over and over again, I've quoted Earl Spencer, who was the brother of Princess Diana and who did the eulogy at her funeral, that genuine goodness is always threatening to those at the opposite end of the moral spectrum. And what worries people in the Barbados Labour Party is that even their most accomplished muckrakers cannot find any muck when they go raking on the cabinet ministers or on the members of Parliament of the Democratic Labour Party. That is what has them worried, because their politics only assumes validity and only has content and character if they can find some kind of scandal to hurl at you. I am very pleased to say that we have a cabinet of Barbados and a core of parliamentarians who have set for themselves the highest possible standards and who can look anybody in Barbados in the face. Now, there's a man in Barbados by the name of Owen Afton. He is supposed to be leader of the Barbados Labour Party. And he, whenever he's got a chance in recent times, has been saying that his aim in politics now is to try and put some money back in people's pockets. He said that he said it was at the Haggard Hall of the boat with Bustle sometime earlier in the year when that forensic audit report on CLECO came out, that he is not like Fundus Short, just interested in talking philosophy, but that he is interested in putting money in people's pockets. Now, I have said over and over again that if there is no difference between the two political parties in Barbados, there is no need for one. If the two parties believe the same thing and stand for the same thing and represent the same core of values, one of them is irrelevant. And therefore, it is important that we in the Democratic Labour Party keep the line of distinction between the Barbados Labour Party and the Democratic Labour Party clear. Because when they say that there is no difference between the two parties, and when their publicists say that there is no difference between the two parties, it benefits them. They appropriate our goodwill. It does not benefit us. And therefore a solemn obligation devolves on our shoulders to make sure that we keep the distinction between the two parties very clear. And this is a work, this is a labor of love. This duty does not end Because every new generation in politics has to be re-educated. You can't take for granted that people understand or know. You have to constantly educate people. You don't follow public opinion. You shape it and instruct it. Because that is what genuine leadership is about. And if you follow what is going on in the United States of America now, you will understand why I'm saying what I'm saying. All the people out there who thought that the battle for the vote was over, the right to vote, now find that they have to get into serious arguments in their country on the eve of an election over their right to vote. Because there are elements, according to what the news reports say and what the channels indicate, who, given a chance, would disfranchise a significant number of them. The political battles are never over. And that is why I want to say a few things here tonight. Because there are some political heresies going around Barbados that have to be dismantled and debunked. And they're not going to be dismantled and debunked by our political adversaries or those people who benefit from what they do and what they say. They have to be dismantled and debunked by us in the Democratic Labour Party. The first heresy is a heresy that has some antiquity about it. And it has to do with the view that trickle-down economics is the solution to all the world's problems. That heresy is being canvassed very strongly in the United States at the moment. It is being canvassed in the United Kingdom. It is being canvassed on the continent of Europe. It has an old history. So far as the 20th century is concerned, it can be traced most conspicuously to an American president by the name of Herbert Hoover, who was president of the United States, I seem to recall, between 1929 and 1933. Now, the Great Depression set in 1929. But Hoover's view was that if you take care of the people at the top, if you look after the interests of the people at the top, they will create a land of milk and honey for all the people at the bottom. Just make them right, and they will have so much food on their tables that the crumbs that fall off from their tables will take care of all the people at the bottom of the society. Now, you would have thought that that old heresy was dismantled and debunked years ago. Nobody would have thought that in the year 2012 there would be people still saying that. And that's the point I'm getting at. You have to re-educate every political generation, because these theories do not die. We in the Democratic Labour Party took a decision on the 27th of April 1955, when we were formed, that we are not in politics to confirm the mighty in their seats, but that we are in politics to exalt the humble and the meek. And that is the explanation of all that we have done from 1955 until now. And you heard Ronald Jones tonight. You heard John Boyce, you heard Stephen Latchley, you heard Chris Sinclair. We have not concerned ourselves with confirming the mighty in their seats. The mighty do not need any political advocates. They are strong enough to advocate for themselves. It is the humble and the meek that need to be exalted and that need our advocacy, and that is why we are the Democratic Party. all of our policies between 2008 and the present have been predicated on that understanding. That is our philosophy, as Chris Hickler said. When we speak from a philosophical standpoint. In fact, when all people speak, they speak from a philosophical standpoint. A lot of them don't know that they're speaking from a philosophical standpoint. But they are. Even a baby, even a child who says the cat is on the mat is making a philosophical statement. That child is saying it is possible to know something called a cat and something called a mat. That child is also saying that you can know there's something called a cat and something called a mat by the use of your five senses, in this case, the sense of sight. And depending on whether the child likes the cat or the mat or not, depending on the mood in which the child says the cat is on the mat, you can know whether the child approves of the cat being there or whether the child wants to move. Every single human being, the people down in the psychiatric hospital who are patients, the people in prison, as I said last Sunday evening in Jermaine, the vagrant who walks around Bridgetown, copiously dressed. The market vendor said he did not know that he knew that somebody called Ninja Man. But there's always something new to learn. I used to stop and talk to Ninja Man sometimes in the mornings on my way to court. But all human beings have a philosophy. All speak from some kind of philosophical position. You may not know that you have it. You may not be able to articulate it, but you speak from a position. You have a view of what it is that it is possible for human beings to know. That is called an ontology. You have a view as to how knowledge is acquired, how it is possible to know it. That is an epistemology. And you have a view of how, when knowledge is acquired, it should be used. That is an axiology, a theory of value. And we all have that whether we know it or not. And therefore, when the people in the Barbados Labour Party talk, I listen to them very carefully. Because I have to determine what is their theory of being, what it is they think it is possible to know, what is their theory of knowledge, how they think knowledge is acquired, and how they handle what information comes into their possession, what information they have at their disposal. And that allows me to distinguish between the Barbados Labour Party and the Democratic Labour Party. Because everything they say, every time they open their mouths to speak, it is for the purpose of putting the case of the people at the top. While we start from the position that the people at the top do not need our advocacy. They've always had advocacy, and they certainly have the advocacy of the Barbados Labour Party to this day. And that the people who have to benefit from our advocacy, from the sound of our voices, are the humble and the meek, the marginalized, the socially voiceless, the masses of the people of Barbados. Chris Hickler was quite right when he made the distinction between the classes and the masses. That's a distinction that is part of the social understanding and the political understanding of the Democratic Labour Party. So we don't accept trickle-down economics. That is why Errol Barrow and Cameron Tudor and all of our great political ancestors intervened in this economy and made sure that the resources of this country were directed in such a way that ordinary men and women could benefit from political decisions. And we don't apologize for that. I hear them all the time. You're always wasting money. If you're spending it on welfare, if you're spending it on young people, if you're spending it on the elderly, all of the defenseless people in this society, and that deal, let me tell you, did not start with them. That was a Tom Adams view as well. That money spent in those areas was not money being productively spent. We beg to differ. So they can stay with their trickle down, where they look after the people at the top. We have no problem with the people at the top, but we say the people at the bottom need our advocacy, need our intervention, and need to benefit from the decisions that we make. That is one distinction between the Barbados Labour Party and the Democratic Labour Party. The second one is this. You hear all this talk about privatization. Now, let us get this very clear. Before the introduction of universal adult suffrage in Barbados in 1951, the politics of this country was dominated by a planter merchant elite. Government was for the rich and for the powerful. Government was for the property. Government was for those who had means. I do not stop telling the story that in 1940 in St. Philip, the parish in which I live and in which I was born and which I grew up, in 1940 when Winter Crawford got elected to the House of Assembly, Crawford won his seat by getting 119 votes. Now there were thousands of people living in St. Philip, but Crawford won his seat by getting 119 votes. You know why? Because although there were thousands of people living in St. Philip, only about 350 or so could vote. And only that number could vote because in those days you had to satisfy either an income qualification or a property qualification. And the vast majority of people in the country were excluded from the decision-making process. So, government, for all practical purposes, was screened off from the interests of the masses and was, in essence, in private hands. My mother was born in 1923, and she had to content herself with a 7th standard education at Bailey's Primary School in St. Philip. And that would have been the fate of the overwhelming majority of people born around that time or before. The point I'm making is this. The private sector in the Caribbean, not only in Barbados, had every chance between 1627 in the case of Barbados and other dates in the case of other parts of the Caribbean, to prove that if you gave them the whole economy to run, they could run it for the benefit of everybody in the society. They had hundreds of years to prove that. They could not prove it. Because the basis on which the private sector operates is completely different from that on which governments operate. And therefore, after the introduction of universal adult suffrage and people could vote for the governments they want to look after their interests, we had, of course, mass political parties by then, and that is how all of the young people in here of my generation and since are able to benefit from access to primary, secondary, and tertiary education, benefit from affordable health care, benefit from all of those things that only the rich could benefit from before the masses had a chance to choose who their leaders should be. Before 1951, the assumption in Barbados was that only rich people can get sick because only rich people could afford to pay for medical care. Today, medical care at affordable prices is available to the masses of the people of Barbados because government got involved. We believe, don't get me wrong, we believe in the importance of the private sector in this country. We have nothing against the private sector. We believe in the mixed economy. That there's a role for the private sector and a role for the government. We believe in the mixed economy, but the secret is always in the mix. There's a distinction, and David Essex would know this better than most of us in this room, between a rum and coke and a coke and rum. The secret is always in the mix. A rum and coke and a coke and rum are not the same thing. So we are very careful about what that mix should look like. And we, as a party, from the time we took up the reins of government in 1961 in the month of December until tonight, we have determined that there are certain things that government should keep under its wing to make sure that the masses of the people of this country are looked after. We don't want to interfere with things that are more properly done by people in the private sector. But we cannot, repeat, cannot give education and health and public transport and so on to the private sector. That would be to undo all the work that the Democratic Labour Party has done over the last 57 years. And we can't do that. So let the word go forth that that is the position of the present government of Barbados. We have a social partnership that we created in the early 90s that is functioning. We have a very cordial relationship between Labour, capital, and the state. And we intend to ensure that that relationship is kept intact. But there are boundaries that must be recognized, and we therefore distinguish ourselves from the Barbados Labour Party in the sense that they believe that you should give away all these things and leave the masses of the people exposed, and we do not. We never have, and we never will get that clear. That's the heresy again that I thought had gone through the window when Margaret Thatcher left office and when Ronald Reagan left office in the United States of America. But we're dealing with it again. Dealing with it here in Barbados. Now let me tell you something. You know what bothers me in politics? Owen Arthur cannot trace anything that he is today to the benefaction of the people whose interests he's now trying to promote. He has benefited from the benefaction of the state of government. But having benefited, he now feels you kick all that aside. I'm all right, Jack. I'm all right. Let the other people get through how they can. That kind of politics is unacceptable to us in the Democratic Party. You know, I thoroughly enjoyed all that I heard here tonight. And that's why I feel I have to make this kind of speech. Because when you go there on the streets and you hear stupid talk, you must be able to defend your party and your government. And you can only defend your party and your government if you understand the distinction between your party and the Barbados Labour Party. So, trickle down, not part of our political theology. This wholesale privatization, no part of our political theology. Thirdly, I spoke about this last Sunday night and I'm going to speak about it again. The land of Barbados. I am speaking to you tonight in the month in which we will celebrate 46 years of Barbados' independence. We were fought on independence too. The same elements that are running around the place now making a lot of noise, their ancestors in politics ran around here in the 1960s saying that Barbados should not go independent. And they fought Errol Barrow and Cammie Tudor tooth and nail on that issue. The record will show that Riley Adams, of course, at some time during his political life, delivered a doxology to colonialism, praised the colonial state of being. So it should not surprise us that they would fight us on independence. But being independent, as I told some people at the Garrison tonight, an entrepreneurship foundation, being independent means certain things. And we put in the national anthem, which we sing so lustily, that the fields and hills of Barbados beyond recall are now ours. I do not believe, and the Democratic Labour Party does not believe, as AFA and the Barbados Labour Party do, that the land of Barbados should fetch its highest economic value or be used for its highest economic purpose. In the sense that, as David Essex would say, Neptune and Triumph could come from wherever they like and buy up all of Barbados and make us strangers in our own country. Can't happen here under the Democratic Labour Party. Let me repeat what I said last Sunday night. Repetition in politics is very important. In 1969, a Property Transfer Tax Act was passed in Barbados. It was passed by the Democratic Labour Party. Errol Barrow was Minister of Finance and Prime Minister. The purpose of that piece of legislation was to enact that persons who were selling land, since they were going to get money for the land they were selling, should make some small contribution to the country's revenue. And the tax was called a property transfer tax. Since you were transferring land from yourself to somebody else and you were getting money for it, contribute some of the money you're getting to the treasury. But Barrow also understood that you couldn't leave it there, because if you left it there, people could come from anywhere in the world and buy up your land, and as long as the vendor paid his property transfer tax, all would be well with the world. So in addition to requiring the vendor to pay 5% property transfer tax, Barrow said the purchaser, if the purchaser is a foreigner, not if the purchaser is a local had to pay nothing. If the purchaser is a foreigner, that purchaser would also have to pay property transfer tax, but at twice the rate at which the vendor was paying. So the vendor was paying at 5%, the purchaser is going to pay 10%. So he not only had to look for the purchase price, but an extra 10% if he wanted to own land in Barbados. And of course, all of that was subject to the permission of the exchange control authorities. And he, as Minister of Finance, because we didn't have a central bank then, he was responsible for all exchange control permissions. So he had ultimate responsibility to decide whether a foreigner would own land in Barbados or not. That worked for us, and it kept Barbados stable. Along comes a political vagrant in 1994, writes a letter to the President of the Inter-American Development Bank pursuant to an investment sector reform program into which the government was entering with the Inter-American Development Bank. And the president of the bank at that time was Senor Enrique Iglesias. Today is Moreno, President Moreno. It was Enrique Iglesias then. And he told Enrique Iglesias in this policy letter he wrote that as far as the government of Barbados, over which he presided, was concerned, land should fetch its highest value in the marketplace. A flat contradiction of all that we had internalized since independence about land in Barbados. Worse than that, to let Iglesias and all of the other persons who were slavering at the mouth to Barbados, to let them know that he was serious about what he was saying, he abolished the property transfer tax payable by the purchasers of land who were foreigners. So the 10% that they would ordinarily have to pay, he abolished. So the only person who has to pay the property transfer tax now is the Barbadian who is selling. The purchaser, the foreign purchaser who is buying, has to pay nothing, just the purchase price. Is it any wonder that Errol Barrow said in this country some years ago that if we are not careful, we'll wake up and find that we don't own this place? And when he was saying it because of the political philosophy of the people who were in the opposition party then. This political straggler had not come along yet. And he's come along and dismantled all of that and has left us completely exposed. Now, let me make it very clear. I've heard a lot about globalization and the triumph of the free market and all of that. I heard all of that. And these things are not new. But let me say this. All globalization has ever meant for me, I don't mind these fancy words. I look behind them to see what they mean and what the end results are going to be. It was not Barbados or Guyana or Trinidad or Tobago or St. Vincent or St. Lucia or any country on the African continent, or not even the ones in South America or Central America, that were promoting globalization. That came from the North Atlantic, from the rich industrialized countries. So the question is, if they want the place globalized, what is the want? Two things. Access to our markets, because the inherent tendency, Frank, I need to tell you this, Any political thinker will tell you this. The inherent tendency of free market structures is to overproduce. So, they want markets to which to sell their goods. And the second thing they want is access to people's land. Access to people's land. That is, when you get past the fancy word globalization, it is access to markets for goods and services and access to land. You hear a lot about human rights. There was a man called Augusto Pinochet in Chile who was as squalid a butcher as he could want any political leader to be. There are people in Chile tonight whose families disappeared and don't know where they're gone up to now. And Pinochet is laying quietly in his grave. Look, although there was all this talk about human rights, Margaret Thatcher defended Pinochet to the hilt. And the people in Washington did the same. You know why? They had access to Chile's markets. So it didn't matter that people were disappearing every other minute. They had access to their markets. The human rights issue is raised about Havana. You know why? They don't have access to their market. So don't mind the word globalization. It's a matter for their policy. I have taken a position. I have said it in the United Nations. I've said it in Parliament of Barbados. I've said it everywhere. I think that relations between Cuba and the United States have to be normalized. I think it's gone past the relevance of embargo and all that kind of thing. But the government of Barbados, over which I preside, and in which people like David Eslick and Chris Sinclair and Dennis Kelman and Richard Seeley and John Boyce and Ronald Jones and Stephen Lashley, in which we all sit, George Hudson, all of us, are not going to genuflect to anybody on the basis that they have enough money to buy up all the land in Barbados. That is not on the cards. You will recall an unpatriotic Prime Minister standing up in Barbados and saying to us that the choice is between selling the land or, horror of horrors, selling ourselves. Talk about prostitution. You imagine being having that said? You got a glass? He's done very well in Barbados. You know, for a man who became a leader by accident, he's done very well in Barbados. He came to the office of Prime Minister totally unprepared. I laugh when I hear those who are trying to crown him with laurels now talking foolishness. But there was never much to demand. A political mediocrity masquerading as somebody of political importance. How can he be of any political relevance? Let me tell you this, you see, I ain't ready to prosecute yet. I am not ready for the political prosecution yet. I let people talk because from my tenderest years, I have to confess I've been severely influenced by the words of the desiderata. I speak my truths quietly and clearly and listen to others, even the dull and the ignorant, because they too have their story. But the time for political prosecution will come. And I hope that when I start to talk, I don't hear any complaints that I talking too much. All right. I know what is worrying them. I hear talk about Mr. Maskell here tonight. You see, if political parties do not maintain their vigilance, you can fall into serious political error. When Maskell was leading the Democratic Labour Party as leader of the opposition in Parliament, I hear people making all kind of fuss, and I understand them. I understand Ronald's sense of outrage and the other people's sense of outrage at this Granny Adams Award. But the real damage was not done with that, because he's not around us. He is sipping from the polluted chalice of the Barbados Labour Party, and he can drink whatever they pour down his throat. But when he was with us, a former MP from this area and former Prime Minister of Barbados, Sir Harold St. John, died. And we, as is the tradition in Parliament, we have to pay tribute to people when they die, especially former Prime Ministers. There's normally a full sitting in the House to do that. We did it for Barrow, we did it for Tom Adams, it's done for St. John, it's done for my late predecessor, distinguished friend David Thompson. That is the tradition. He is. But you say he has no class, and I won't go beyond that. Look, you know the leader of the Democratic Labour Party, the man who was leading Errol Barrow's party in the House of Assembly in 2004 when Bernard St. John died, stood up in the Parliament of Barbados and in paid tribute to Sir Harold St. John, leading Barrow's party, leading the team of DAP parliamentarians, said that Bernard St. John was always his role model in politics. I hear people expressing all this horror about the receipt of the Granny Adams Award, but I can't think of anything more damaging to the Democratic Labour Party than what happened that day in Parliament, when its leader, leading Errol Barrow's party, leading a party that was led by Erskine Sandiford, leading a party that was led by David Thompson, he stood up in Parliament, paying tribute to St. John, and saying that St. John was always his role model in politics. We can't want it better than that. And mind you, and I don't want to get into this because we have political boundaries, we have boundaries in politics. But there was a settled antipathy for years between Sir Harold St. John and that young man's father-in-law, Anderson Peanuts Morrison. Frank Allen and Randall McLean in 1971, among others, had to try and vindicate Anderson Peanuts Morrison's cause in Christchurch, South Central it was then, after he was ridiculed as coming from a small house and not deserving of being elected to the House of Assembly. And that man stood up in the House of Assembly when paying tribute to St. John and say that St. John was Israel's model in politics and lead the Democratic Labour Party. But when you don't speak from any philosophical position, when you don't have any philosophical clarity, those are the mistakes to which you are prone in politics. And I really thought that after he left us, he might have stumbled on some clarity. But as it has turned out, he is now in more political darkness than at any other time in his entire political career. Keep the lines of distinction between the Democratic Labour Party and the Barbados Labour Party clear. We don't accept trickle down. Let me tell you what that great liberal economist John Kenneth Galbraith said about trickle down. He said, whenever you hear people talking trickle down economics, what they're telling you is that if birds are to get more food, the way to do that is to give a horse more oats. Of the 20th century. He said he rejected trickle-down economics. He said all it means is that if birds are to get more food, you have to give a horse more oats. We reject that. We reject the privatization theology. We reject the uninhibited sale of Barbados' land to foreigners. We believe that the fields and hills beyond recall are our very own and should continue to be our own, and that if we alienate it is within the context of what we have decided after prudent judgment. And let me make one last point that distinguishes us from the Barbados Labour Party before I sit down. It has been part of the theology of the Democratic Labour Party from its inception until now that Barbados is not just a question of individuals running around aligning with one another. That Barbados is not just an economy. Barbados is a society. Put that way by David Thompson, he captured for us what the Democratic Labour Party has lived for its entire existence. Now, he had to say that. He said it in Barbados, and he had to say it because there are people in Barbados who believe that Barbados is only an economy. There's a woman in England, distinguished lady, Baroness Margaret Thatcher, who is on record as saying that there is nothing called a society. That what you have are individuals living in a certain geographical area pursuing their own individual interests. She is on record as saying that there's nothing called a society. Now, of course, she sat at the feet of a man called Sir Keith Joseph, who believed that as well. He believed it so strongly that he was well on his way to becoming leader of the Conservative Party instead of Margaret Thatcher, because she was never in the running. But he believed in that so strongly that he got up in Britain and delivered us a blistering speech at a branch meeting, attacking disadvantaged working class women for having children. He said that the people in England who should be having children are the highest and the better off. Something called eugenics, a belief that children should only come from certain wombs. I'm very glad nobody believed that in 1951, because I would not be here tonight. I came from the modest womb of a maid. And that is how most of us are here ended up on this planet. But these views have to be fought over and over and over again, because they do not die. In the United States presidential campaign, in this campaign, there were people in United States politics in the year 2012 saying that if a woman gets raped and becomes pregnant, that's God's will. And one other one said that if a woman gets raped, that's no problem, because women know what to do with their bodies to reject the effects of rape. These are battles that are still being fought in the 21st century. But Margaret Thatcher said there's nothing called a society. Now, the countries of the Caribbean, Barbados included, Barbados was settled in 1627. And the people who came here did not intend to create any society here. They came here to use these islands, Barbados included, as outposts for production. They were not interested in any schools. They were not interested in hospitals for the sick. They were not interested in any of the social amenities that we take for granted nowadays. These islands were intended for production. Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, name them. Production. Because for that reason, at one stage in Barbados' history, it was described as the brightest jewel in the British crown. Not because of how many children were going to school, but because of how much sugar was being produced and the quality of that sugar. So these islands began as economies, not as societies. Rather than build schools in these islands, the British built prisons. Only after the 1930s and the advent of mass political parties, and after 1951 and universal adult suffrage, where the only criteria you had to satisfy was to reach age 21 and then you could vote. Only after that period did we in these islands and we in Barbados embark on creating a society here. Although emancipation happened in 1834, apprenticeship 1838, 100 years later, between 1838 and 1938, not much had changed in Barbados for the ex-slaves. And that's why we had the West, and that is why the Money Commission had to report on far-reaching changes that had to be executed in these islands in the Caribbean, Barbados included, if people were to have their quality of life elevated to some state of respectability. And from the 1950s, we began to create a society in Barbados. Now, in the 1950s, the Barbados Labour Party was in office. They passed a few pieces of the labor legislation, and they built a few schools. Don't take that away from them. What they take away from them is that they were hijacked by a group of young politicians in the 60s and 70s that cut them off from their early moorings, and they haven't found those moorings again since. And the Democratic Labour Party therefore had to come in and fill that breach. That is why Errol Barrow and Cameron Tudor broke from the Barbados Labour Party and formed the Democratic Labour Party in 1955. Tudor broke first. Tudor broke from the Barbados Labour Party in 1954 and fought a by-election in St. Lucie, virtually by himself. Barrow was still in the Democratic Labour at the time. Tudor fought that by-election. I tell you who fought it with it. O.N.T. Alder and L.B. Bradford. The same L.B. Bradford that ended up in the Barbados Labour Party. This political history is very important. Tudor had to snatch the microphone from L.B. Bradford during that by-election, so he ended up only having O.N.T. Alder to help him. And he had to snatch the microphone from L.B. Bradford because L.B. Bradford washed Grace Adams later to become Lady Adams and cursed from that platform. And Tudor was so embarrassed he had to snatch the microphone from him and did not allow him to speak with him after the by-election campaign. The morning that Sybil Leacock was thrown in at Government House, in 1984, after she won the by-election by one vote or whatever it is in St. Peter, I took up the paper the following day and saw a photograph with Tom Adams talking to Cameron Tudor. And I said, well, this photograph strikes me as very strange. What would these two men be talking about? So I took up the phone and called Cammy. I said, Cammy, I saw this photograph in the paper. I don't understand this. I mean, are you and Tom friends? He said, Fonda, let me tell you something. He came up to me and he was talking to me. He's the Prime Minister of Barbados, and I extended courtesies to him. He said, but you know what he was telling me? I said, no, tell me. He said, Cammy, you remember that night in St. Lucie when you had to snatch the microphone from L.B. Bradford because of how bad he cursed my mother? Cammy said, of course I remember that. How could I forget it? He said, Cammy, you know, I've always respected you for that. And I will never forget you for that. But I'm going to tell you this, I will never forget L.B. Bradford either. And L.B. Bradford was in his cabinet at the time. It was only God's mercy that Tom died before he got a chance to pay it back. But Tudor left and went fought that by-election after Lorenzo Williams resigned and went off to St. Lucia, still living there. Won, and when it became clear to all that Grandy was not as impregnable as people thought he was, then the fellows moved, broke with it, and formed the Democratic Labour Party. But the Democratic Labour Party, ever since it came into existence, has done more than any political party in Barbados to create that society, to build that society that was lacking in this country for so many hundreds of years. It was the Democratic Labour Party that put in place all of those social mechanisms that now hold Barbados together and of which we can be so proud. A social security system that has no equal in the Caribbean. Free secondary education, free university education, school meals for children, bus fares for children. We have our youth camps, we have severance payment legislation, we have succession legislation. I could go on and on and on. The Democratic Labour Party helped to create that society of which David Thompson so eloquently spoke when he said that Barbados is not just an economy, it is also a society. And let me tell you this before I say that. Although we have all these things, very important, although we have all of these things, and I'm back to this idiocy about putting money in people's pockets, because if putting money in people's pockets is what all politics is about, but if you don't put the money in people's pocket, there are people in Barbados who know how to get it. So you're saying that So don't get tired. But let me say this. If every single person in this room and in this country tonight had all the money they wanted, all the land they wanted, the house they wanted, got all the education they wanted, had the job they wanted, if they had all of their needs satisfied, that would still not be enough to create a society in Barbados. Because a society is not held together by those things. A society is held together by something called values. And that is what was missing from the social life and the public life of Barbados between 1994 and 2008. People walked around and all they heard said about themselves is how much money they were earning and what kind of house they were living in. But they never heard about the deeper things of life from their political leadership. So you have the remarkable spectacle in Barbados tonight, where a man was Prime Minister of Barbados from 1994 to 2008. Nobody knows what his views are on labor. I never thought about it. Nobody knows what his views are on education, because he never thought about that either. He's talked about the cost of education, but not about education itself. Nobody knows what his views are on the woman question, because he never thought about that either. He's talked about women. And apparently he does that very well, because I'm told he was in a house in St. Philip a few weeks ago saying some very, I won't go into that, okay. You can talk, you have as a politician to have a view on the woman question. Errol Barr had a view on that, that's why we have succession legislation. Simon could have a view on it, that's why we have domestic violence legislation. That's why we have maternity leave legislation, because this party has always had a view on the woman question. You don't know the man think about youth, you never thought about it. Yes! We don't know what he thinks about the church, the role of the church in the society. He never thought about it. All of these are issues that you could hear Errol Barr talking about non-stop between 1961 and 1976, and between 1976 and 1986, 87 until he died. Because you can't be any political leader anywhere in the world unless you have clear views, well articulated on these questions. You can't be. So, all he's ever talked about is GDP, and foreign reserves, and current account deficit. All of these things important to themselves. But we are not just economic beings. We are social beings as well. When a man gets up in the mornings to go to work, he does not say, I'm leaving my social self at home. I'm just leaving, I'm going to catch the bus with only my economic self. We are not just homo economicus, economic man. We have other dimensions to our lives. And if a man leaves home and is left a disabled child or a sick wife in his house, it is bound to affect his performance at work. So you cannot just view people in those narrow economistic terms. Frank Kelly will tell you that. But this man, not out here for 40 years, And nobody knows what he thinks for any of these things. That's why I have described it without apology as the barren fig tree of Barbadian politics. And then coming back, say he wanted to run the country again, to say what? Even the members of his own profession now are beginning to see through it. And to come to the recognition that if they want him in a raffle, they'll give it. But there's nothing in the man. Always cooperating. Relying on fear. I like Ronald Jones's expression, the management of perceptions. Relying on that to beguile and deceive people into believing that they have signed off of Barbados. I told you all at Queen's College, and don't forget the challenge I threw. I told you what Erava's legacy is in Barbados. I told you what Granny Adams' legacy is in Barbados. I told you what Tom Adams' legacy is in Barbados. I told you what Erskine Sandiford's legacy is in Barbados. I told you what Sahara St. John's legacy is in Barbados. I told you what David Thompson's legacy is in Barbados. I want you to tell me what Owenatha's legacy in Barbados is. What is it that he did between 1994 and 2008 that so benefited Barbadians that they rejoice tonight and say, as long as we live, we will remain eternally indebted to this man for this? Not one thing. GDP and PNP and BP and everything else, and nothing at all of substance for the society. That's why the Democratic Labour Party, as Ronald Jones correctly said, had to come into office and clean up all this mess. And the mess with which we had to start was a society that was basically broken. And we're trying to put it back together, where people establish a completely different relationship with one another, not just a relationship based on how much money they got in their pocket. National identity. And therefore, as I said last week, beware of false prophets who come to you dressed in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. By their fruits ye shall know them. We've had to wait long for the truth to be revealed. But I always tell people, truth is not like milk. Truth does not curdle and spoil. Whenever the truth is told, it is still fresh. And I can close with the words of a great American poet, James Russell Lowell. He said this: truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future. And behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. Don't get too disgruntled and too disheartened when it seems as though truth is always on the scaffold and wrong is always on the throne. Always remember, it is that scaffold that sways the future. And behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. Stay with the dens. Good luck to you.